old enough to be our own mother. So yeah. So Allah yahfadha ya Rabbi. Okay, everybody. So we're going to be doing, inshallah, our, let's see, here we go. We're going to be doing the continuation for the prayer conditions. And remember, when we talked about the prayer conditions, we talked about the word condition, and we said what we mean by condition. They're conditions, but they're pretty much the prerequisites that come before Salah, or let's say within Salah. So we're speaking about not the actual prayer itself, but we're talking about the prerequisites that are related to Salah. Let's say it that way. So whether it's related, meaning prior to Salah, or whether we're speaking about place, whether we're speaking about time, whether we're speaking about the garment that you're wearing, and that's basically what we mean by the conditions. So we talked about the first condition, which is timing. And when we started talking about timing, we started kind of speaking a little bit about the debate between scholars. Is it the beginning of the time that we would consider that this is when you're mandated to pray, or is it the end of time that would mark that this is when you were considered that you were obligated to pray? And we talked about the implication for this debate. And we said, let's say a sister would get her period, and of course, she didn't pray. Let's say she got her period at, let's say, 2 p.m. and dhuhr wasn't until what was it actually was at 1. She didn't pray dhuhr when it was 1 p.m. and she got her period at 2, and Asr is at 4, let's say. Okay, now she's wondering whether she has to make up dhuhr or not. Now, that's the implication of that debate. So you had some scholars, I'll just use the word some, I don't want to use all the different names, just to make it easier on the sisters that are new to fiqh. So you had some scholars say, well, no, the beginning of the prayer is when you're actually mandated to pray. So the scholars that said the obligation starts at the beginning of the prayer, the prayer time, they said, well, she's mandated just because her prayer time started at 1 p.m. She got her period at 2. That means she basically had the time, that window between 1 and 2, and she didn't do it, then she would have to make it up. The scholars that said that no, the mandation of a prayer wouldn't be from the time that you would enter the prayer time zone, but it would be when you would basically have the whole time zone. In other words, we're talking about the whole timing from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. in this situation, for example. Okay. And therefore, if she didn't have the time and the full time to pray from 1 to 4 p.m., then in that situation, she would not be mandated to pray, because the 4 p.m., that was the end of that window, and she surely didn't get the whole thing. So that's that implication of that debate, just for us to kind of see it, that I know sometimes sisters are like, okay, am I supposed to be making it up? Am I not supposed to be making it up? So just wanted to give you a taste of some of those differences of opinions when we speak about the beginning of a prayer and the end of a prayer. So that wasn't just it, but we also talked about the beginning of a prayer. Are we speaking about the beginning of the prayer in general as a blessed thing for us to pray at the beginning? So we said the salawat, that it's a blessing to pray in the beginning of its times, are basically 1, Fajr, we're talking about Dhuhr, we're talking about Asr, the most one, and Maghrib, the second most one. Isha, what's recommended is basically that you would delay praying Isha till, let's say, the ending of the time. So we're speaking about close to midnight. And we said that the definition of midnight in the Islamic term is not 12 p.m., but is actually calculated based on Maghrib time. So you would, let's say, get, let's say 6 p.m. is Maghrib time, and then you would look at Fajr time, let's say it's 6 a.m., for example, and well, that one's going to make it into 12. Okay, let's say
Question.
Fajr
So
time. Right, so you're basically going to divide the timing from Fajr time to Maghrib time. You're going to divide that by two to figure out uh, the Islamic time and what is considered midnight. Okay, now then they went into a debate whether midnight actually marks the beginning of a new day or whether it's just midnight, and not necessarily the beginning of a new day. Then they had differences of opinions on, well, what marks a new day? Is a new day marking it from Fajr, or is a new day marking it from midnight? So just wanted to help you understand why the differences of opinions in that regards for Isha. When is the end time for Isha? Is the end time for Isha midnight, and it's the beginning of a new day according to those scholars? Or is the beginning of Isha so going to be marked by Fajr? Okay, by Fajr. So if, let's say, in Minnesota, we would sometimes have Isha at 11 p.m. And that can be really hard for those that have, let's say, a 5 a.m. shift or something like that, because guess what? Fajr on those times would actually be around 4 a.m. So, they're barely getting enough sleep, and it would be really hectic for those that basically have those kind of schedules. Let's see. Noura's asking, was it certain times of the year the Prophet ﷺ would delay Isha? No, it wasn't certain times of the year at all, dear. It was something that the Prophet ﷺ in general had recommended, and he said that that was actually the timing of Isha, but it's just to make it easier for people since they have to go to work. They've got their schedules. Some are really tired. They want to go home and just relax and sleep. So then he said that it would be permissible for them to pray Isha at that early times, which when we say early times, we're talking about when the sun had completely set. Okay, so that was Maghrib. When the sun had completely set and even its rays are gone. So we're speaking about, you're starting to see the stars starting to shine. You're starting to see that it's complete darkness right there. Excluding the moon. The moon is definitely going to give you some, depending on if it's full moon or not, but it's gonna be a different source of light. But we're speaking about that the sun rays and the sun that's making glimpse of Maghrib, that it's completely gone. That's when your Isha really starts. And we talked about, can I use an app, for example, on my phone? So I wanted to clarify that you could definitely use the app, and the different things that we talked about in terms of timing. When is the actual timing? That's to help you understand how those different apps actually use the differences of opinions between scholars on and how and why you end up having different timings. Just wanted to say that those opinions are considerable opinions, and therefore I don't want you stressing out that, oh, this app is right, is that app wrong, etc. Just wanted you to know that those are considerable opinions, and what is important is, hey, be with the jama'ah. If the masjid is basically praying at that time, pray with the jama'ah, pray with them. You don't have to stress, oh, but my app is this or my app is that, or I'm with this or that group. You're fine with all those, whether you're Hanafi, Shafi'i, etc. You don't have to be any specific madhab whatsoever. They're all considerable opinions, at least when we're speaking about the madhab, when we're speaking about the different schools. So whether you're Shafi'i, Hanafi, Hanbali, they all had learned from one another. You don't have to follow a specific school. Every one of those schools is basically a considerable school. They learn from one another, and that's all that I would like to say in that regards for now. But definitely scurrying, rushing, or at least rushing to start the prayer. We're not talking about rushing, at the expense of having a poor wudu, but we're speaking about trying to make your prayer as early as possible, is basically considered an extra credit for your faith, and is definitely considered as something that that resembles your keenness on being closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those that would be included in as-sabiqun, for those that are sari'u ila maghfiratin min rabbikum, for those that are keen on the prayer times, those are or all things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had praised. Layla Ali, you wanted to say something, dear. Go ahead.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I think it's the Hanbali madhab, they pray Asr late, right? And so if you go to the masjid and they're like just almost close, they're
It's
like really,
actually
really,
the Hanafi.
it's
It's
Hanafi. Oh,
actually the Hanafi, not the Hanbali. It's
so
the Hanafi. They pray it a little later, but that's because they consider that it has to be double the shadow. Okay, and they're really specific about that, but not until they don't delay it until Asr, meaning until the sun starts turning yellow. All scholars agree that when the sun starts turning yellow, that timing is basically hated to pray in unless you still didn't pray Asr. But they would
but
all agree that if you had delayed Asr till the sun was yellow, that you had really made it too late. Okay?
so when it becomes yellow, that becomes the forbidden times to pray.
When it becomes the forbidden times to pray, unless you still didn't pray, then you
Okay.
have to pray and you had pretty much procrastinated it.
Okay, so if you're in their masjid, you just wait for them. You're not like, say, Asr. You just
So
wait and pray with the
for the
Hanafi.
Hanafi madhab still, they don't delay it till the sun is yellow. They don't delay it till the sun is yellow. They just delay the beginning of it. We're speaking about not by long. We're speaking about almost half an hour difference or 25 minutes difference. That's basically, so it's not a huge difference. Okay, now we're going to go to the second piece of conditions. So we talked about the differences for timing. So now we're going to talk about satr al-awra, covering, oops, sorry about that. Covering the awra. And I want you to look at the word awra. I think we talked about the word awra before, but I'm going to talk about it in again so we can make it clear. When we're speaking about covering the awra. Now the awra itself, when we say awra, the word itself actually has multiple meanings. So the first meaning means just a general area of an area of gap. And it can mean العورة can also mean any let's say a mistake, that's also awra. In other words, something shortcomings, that's also awra. In other words, we're speaking about a word that actually has multiple meanings, just like in many words in Lugha Arabiya. So when we speak about satr al-awra, we're speaking about covering the private part. We're speaking about covering the areas that people are supposed to be feeling shy to uncover. Okay, so that would be al-awra. Then, of course, the conditions for covering the awra, we could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya bani Adama, khudhu zinatakum inda kulli masjid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, O children of Adam, take your zina, take your beautification every time you go to the masjid. So when we say is zina is different than zina, because zina is supposed to be a type of beautification. Zina is supposed to be adultery or fornication. So those are two different things, definitely not related. Okay, so is zina, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, take the beautification with you, in other words, beautify yourself before you go to the masjid, this is to basically refer as a metaphor to refer that modesty is in itself the beautification. This isn't saying, ladies, before you go to the masjid, beautify yourself, put on that makeup, put on that jewelry, and go and head to the masjid. This isn't whatsoever saying that, but this is saying that modesty is beautification. The best beautification that you can have is basically modesty. Okay. And the Prophet ﷺ had said in the hadith, لا يقبل الله صلاة حائض إلا بخمار. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the prayer of a woman that reached the age of puberty. I want you to look at this one. Salat ha'id doesn't mean that when you are menstruating that you could pray while you're having your period, but this is saying if that woman had reached the age of puberty, basically period for a girl, then in that situation she must be wearing a khimar. What is al-khimar? Al-khimar is basically the term to mean the covering, to mean modesty, but il-khimar, it is not exclusive to having a facial covering or a head covering, but that word was the word that they had used in the prophetic word, let's say it that way, to mean the covering of the rest of the body, because the ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab was actually talking about jalabib. It was talking about jalabib. In other words, it's a garment that you cover your body with, and therefore the Prophet ﷺ was explaining that she would have to basically cover. And we said, if we're speaking about salat ha'id, if we're speaking about a girl, we're speaking about praying and when they would reach the age of puberty, if it's a girl, and if it's a and if we're speaking about boys, we're basically talking about boys reaching the age of puberty of what is called the wet dream. Now, we know that when we're speaking about puberty, we're speaking about 5 stages of puberty. And we're speaking about one, the stage when they still didn't really show the signs. So that would be around 10 years old. They don't usually show signs around 10, but some will show signs. So if we're talking about a boy, for example, not yet showing any signs, so they pretty much are, let's say, hormonal changes, but you don't really recognize those hormonal changes. It isn't until they start going to stage 2, slight voice changes, slight hair changes, etc. So those would be some of the signs that boys and girls would be showing. Girls, maybe mood swings. Girls, probably the beginning of probably changes on the breast, or probably changes on certain parts of the body, and certainly more hair on the body for boys and girls. And then certainly stage 3, more changes basically the reproductive system basically showing signs of more and more changes for both boys and girls. And then finally at stage 5, that marks, let's call it the main change, is basically a girl starting to get a period and a boy basically starting to get what is called a wet dream. So that basically marks the end of the stages of puberty. But of course, when we're speaking about stages of puberty in the reproductive system is not necessarily what we would consider as the only area of maturity or the only area of being held accountable. We would also take in consideration the mental development as well. So if we had a girl that probably reached the age of puberty, or at least let's not call it the age of puberty, but started, let's say, getting a period at the age of 7, we would take in consideration her ability to understand, her ability to process. So yes, she probably, and of course we know with the foods, they're telling us that the foods are right now affecting the puberty age and when they're reaching those ages. And we basically are told that the food is affecting girls, and they're getting early puberty and all of that. So what does that really mean? At the end, we would consider that when we're speaking about puberty, we're speaking about one, the body changes, the physical changes, and we're also taking into consideration mental changes and mental development as well. But in general, we would consider that 10 years old or 11 or 12, within that time frame, if they reach the age of puberty, that they are treated as adults in Islam. What do we mean by the word that they're treated as adults? They're treated as adults, meaning that we have to teach them that this is a milestone, that they are now capable of being accountable for their prayer, being accountable for certain responsibilities that they should be taking. So this is what it means. And this is an encouragement to also let them act in responsible ways, let them act older than their age, let them basically feel that they are mature. Therefore, they should be taking their words seriously. They should be taking their decision-making seriously, and that they're actually right now considered within the adult group, and therefore you should be acting like an adult and not thinking that you're a child and you should be somehow being negligent about your responsibilities. This isn't to mean that they cannot play. This isn't mean that doesn't mean that they can't go biking, that they cannot go, I don't know, martial arts and all of that. Not at all. This does not mean that whatsoever. Even adults can do these trainings. They're good physical exercises and good for your body, etc. So this isn't whatsoever saying, I know in some cultures they would think this is more for kids and not for adults. And this is definitely not the case. And not necessarily true. Okay, now to continue, I think someone posted a question right there. Okay, where is it? Okay, I can't see the question. Okay, so when we say لا يقبل الله صلاة حائض إلا بخمار, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept the prayer of a woman until, or who has reached, sorry, not until, but who has reached the age of puberty until or unless she wears a veil. So that's that veil, to explain the veil. And how do we know that this isn't speaking about just putting on a headscarf? Okay, how do we know that? Well, we would know that based on the other ahadith. So in order to understand the text, you want to make sure you go to the other texts that would explain one text. So if one text is containing some ambiguity, you would have to go to the other text to make sure that your interpretation for that particular word is accurate and not based on perhaps a literal wording and then giving the wrong interpretation, but you're taking in consideration the other text to make interpreting that particular wording in an accurate way. So let's see. Ibn Abd al-Barr. Who's Ibn Abd al-Barr? I know it says in your book right there, Ibn Abd al-Barr. So just wanted to say Ibn Abd al-Barr is a scholar from the Maliki madhab. And I think I wanted to note that one because I wanted you to see that this book, that's why I love this book. It's an excellent book. He doesn't make it exclusive to a certain madhab, but he tries as much as possible to use the preponderant opinions and to get to the preponderant opinions to make it easy, simple, and straightforward without going into all the details of the differences of opinions, because I know that can be confusing for some people. Let's see the quote. أجمعوا على فساد صلاة من ترك ثوبه وهو قادر على الاستتار به وصلى عريانا. So what did he say? He said, scholars unanimously agree on the invalidity of the prayer of one who refrains from clothing and performs it naked, though able to clothe oneself and conceal one's awra. So there was that unanimous agreement that if you're capable of praying, and you had the garments, you had basically the clothes to cover yourself, that you would have to cover yourself, and that it would not be valid. Your prayer would not be valid to pray while you're uncovering unless the person had the reason to do so. So, for example, you would hear these horrifying stories of the people that were in the prisons of Saidnaya or the prisons of Tadmur, and they would tell you that they were stripped naked and for days, and were even, they would have no ability to even make wudu or even make the movement for prayer. So in those situations, we would say that it would be permissible for those people to pray. In fact, they would still be mandated to pray, even though they don't have garments to cover their awra, or even though they don't have the means to do any purification. So they would do tayammum. What if they're not allowed to move? Like, just for example, in Saidnaya, they were telling us these horrifying stories that they were not even allowed to move, and they were basically given only one position to be in, which is look against the wall and not move. And they would even use the bathroom on themselves because they were not even
Or
allowed
in
to.
those Chinese ones.
Or
The Chinese.
Or in those Chinese, what they call them, re-education camps, or who knows what they call them, but of course, or those camps. And I think we had a sister that was actually part of the Uyghurs. Am I right? What was her name, Nuda? We had one of those sisters that was actually part of the Uyghurs that was joining our classes, and she was telling us
I forgot her name.
got her name. She was actually part of where was she? She was attending our tafsir class. She'll probably attend it another time. Okay. So let's see another hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, احفظ عورتك إلا من زوجتك أو ما ملكت يمينك. The Prophet ﷺ had said in the hadith, conceal your private part except from your wife and from whom your right hand possesses, the slave girl. Okay. And then the question was asked when, of course, he said, what if we are basically alone and, at other times? And the Prophet ﷺ, and let's see, he said, even the Prophet ﷺ quote said, if it is within your power that no one looks at your awra, then let no one look at it. Then let no one look at it. What if you're alone? The Prophet ﷺ said, when he was asked, what if you were alone? He responded, it is more entitled to shown bashfulness than people. In other words, even if you're alone, don't be naked and alone naked. Even if you're alone, make sure you cover your awra, even if you're alone, because have the bashfulness even when you are alone, that you don't want to strip naked. Well, it doesn't mean you can't take a shower, but we're speaking about, times when of course, when you're taking a shower, you would need to strip naked. Well, that's because you want to wash, you want to fully cleanse yourself. That's a different story. But to basically be naked just for the fun of it or whatever it is, that's basically not the sunnah. That's not the sunnah, and it's definitely something that the Prophet ﷺ had said, Allahu ahaqqu an yustahya min, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more entitled to show bashfulness to than people. So if you're shy from people, then you should be even more shy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Let's see right there. Someone is asking a question. Can covering be less ample? In other words, loose than outside at home, or the way you cover outside should be the same at home? I mean, with the angels. So if we're speaking about covering, we're speaking about whether there are non-mahram men present or not. Okay, so if we're speaking about maharim, meaning we're speaking about your your father, your great-grandfather. So maybe we should note that down right there. Okay, let's actually note that. Okay, so maybe we could do it like this. If we're speaking about the maharim, we're speaking about your father. In other words, we're talking about the biological relations. So note that one. We're speaking about your father. We're speaking about your hamkumum. We're speaking about your uncles, your mother's side and your father's side. In other words, your dad's brothers, those would also be your mahram. We're also talking about grandfathers and great-grandfathers. So those, think of it as a line, okay? The line of your father, grandfather, grandfather and so forth. And those would be the line of your ancestry, basically, right there. So those would be considered your first mahram. Your second mahram, now we're going downwards. Well, now we're going we're talking about the siblings. So whether we're speaking about siblings, whether we're speaking about half brothers, okay? We're speaking about half brothers, so we're talking about step brothers. That now I'd like to explain step brothers, because in some cultures they would use step brothers for even for adopted children, that they would be step brothers, but no, we're speaking about a step brother, whether we're talking about if they're biologically you're sharing your mother and father, that's a full brother, okay? Or, well, in this situation, we're talking about brothers only, because we're talking about the men that she would have to wear the hijab and, or the men that she can take off her hijab from, and therefore, who is she obligated then? If we know who she can take her hijab in front of, then we would know who she's obligated to wear the hijab in front of. And certainly, if we're talking about the step brothers, those would be the brothers that you would share a mother or a father with. Okay, so whether that person was before she got married, let's give an example right there. Let's say a woman named Asya, okay? Asya had Maryam, let's say, from a previous marriage, okay? And then later on, she gets married to someone else, okay? Then in that situation, she basically had new children, okay? Then the children that she later had, of course, the Maryam, which basically was from a previous marriage, would be a stepsister for all the children that she later had from the other marriage. Okay. Now, here's the question. What if we're speaking about a man right now? Let's say this man, this man
Is
was
it step or half when you share like a parent?
it would step or half, it's the same thing.
I thought step is like when you guys are like two people come together with their children with other from different marriages.
Okay.
I could be wrong. I don't know.
So in Islam, I'm clarifying that. Just give me a second, dear. So in Islam, that half sister, when she shares a mother or a father, basically with that person, okay? So if we are speaking about, let's say, from a previous marriage, I'm going to clarify it, okay? If let's say Asya was married and she had a daughter from a previous marriage. Then she gets married to another man, okay? Gets married to another man. Now, that Maryam that she had would be a mahram to who? Would be a mahram to the man that now Asya is married to, with differences of opinions between scholars, okay? Just a note. This girl is basically called Rabiba. Let me use that word. This girl is called Rabiba. Now we're speaking about this girl that basically comes from a previous marriage, and now Asya is married to a different man, okay? Now, this man that Asya is married to is going to be acting as a stepfather, basically, stepfather to Maryam. Now, if she, before the age of puberty, Asya got married to this man, and little Maryam grew up within this household, then all scholars would agree that she can take off her hijab in front of this new husband. Okay? But then they had differences of opinions. If she had reached the age of puberty already, let's say she was 18, okay, let's say she was 18 when Asya decided to remarry, and would this Maryam, who's 18 already, would she be considered Rabiba for the new husband or not? Differences of opinions between scholars. Okay, that's a different story. Now, what about if it's a man that was married before and he basically comes into this marriage? Okay, let's say he had 2 kids, 2 sons before. And then Asya gets married to this man, and he already has 2 sons from previous marriage. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Asya would be a mahram if an actual marriage was consummated, would be a mahram to this new husband's children. And this new husband's children, they are a mahram to Asya, and therefore she can take her hijab off in front of basically this man's children. Okay, whether they grew within the marriage household or whether they were already 20 and 18 or not. Okay, just to clarify that would not be Rabiba. Okay, they would not be Rabib if you were to make it into a masculine. Okay, now, yet Maryam would not be a mahram. They would not be a mahram. That is the boys from the previous marriage. They would not be a mahram to Maryam. Okay, but they would be a mahram to Asya. Did I explain that one? Why? Because to answer your question, if we're speaking about step, certainly they would be step brothers, but they would not be mahrams to Maryam, but they would be mahrams to Asya. Okay. Now, in terms of siblings, wanted to explain that one since you wanted, I guess, a different term for step and full and half. Okay, so the siblings, if we're speaking about sharing a mother or a father, that would basically be considered as a mahram. If you share a mother or you share a father with that person, then that would be a mahram. Or we're going to talk about the milk relations later, inshallah. The third one is basically now we're going not, if we were to draw a drawing, for example, put I got the lousiest drawing ever. I know that piece of it. Okay. If we're speaking about, let's say grandfathers and above, and now we're talking about siblings. All right. And then now we're talking about, of course, the brothers' children. And certainly when we're speaking about the brothers' children, we're speaking about basically the nephews. Okay. So let's go back to oh no, it got deleted. Oh dear. Okay, so let's do this again. We talked about the fathers and we talked about the grandfathers. Then the second one, we talked about the siblings. Okay, and we talked about the step. And with that, we talked about the Rabiba. Sorry, we lost our notes. And now we're speaking about the siblings' children. The siblings' children would be basically a mahram as well. So we're talking about nephews here. So whether it's your sister's children or whether it's your brother's children, those would be mahram. There's a sister that asked a question. So in the case of Maryam story, the Maryam example, can Maryam marry any of the guys that were basically from the previous marriage for basically her stepfather? The answer is yes. there can be a marriage between Maryam and basically that man's children, unless we're speaking about certainly, unless we're speaking about if Asia's children, basically, now they would be sharing a mother and a father. Okay, but we're speaking about the girl that comes from a previous marriage and basically the man's boys that come from a previous marriage. Now, Maryam is not related to any of that. Okay, so in that situation, she can get married to one of those boys, certainly. Okay, so we're talking about the siblings, the step, and certainly then we're going to be talking about the children. So whether we're speaking about the person's children or the person's grandchildren, all those would be mahrams. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all a long life to see your great-great-grandchildren, right?
I mean,
With good health. With good health, inshallah. Allahumma ameen. Okay, so the other piece is basically the milk relations. What is a milk relation? So they basically drank from the same cup of milk? No. We're speaking about milk relations in terms of, let's say, nursing mother. If a mother nursed a child, then the children and all the children that nursed from that mother, whether it was during the same time or at another time, what do we mean by another time? We're speaking about perhaps a different generation. So let's say Fatima was a woman that just loved nursing children, okay, and she was running a daycare and she nursed the children in her daycare. She nursed, let's say, I don't know, Abdullah, and nursed Abdullah, and later, let's say 10 years later, she was still running a daycare and nursed, let's say, Yusuf. Okay, then in that situation, Abdullah and Yusuf would be milk brothers, even though they're a completely different generation. Why would they be brothers? They would be brothers because they basically had nursed from the same woman. Now, any child, whether it was a biological child or whether it was someone that Fatima had nursed, would be considered a milk brother or basically a milk brother or a sister to that person, to that Abdullah. Okay, just to clarify that one. The other thing is, if we're speaking about the case of Abdullah, for example, in that situation, if we're speaking about, let's say it was not Abdullah, the girl was basically Maryam, okay? The girl, Maryam, nursed from Fatima. So Maryam's milk father, that is the man that, only the man that Fatima was married to. If Fatima was married to, let's say, Ahmed, okay, then Ahmed would be the milk father for Maryam. Okay, the milk father for Maryam. And in that situation, even Ahmed's brothers are milk brothers to Maryam. The same exact way as a biological map, you would basically do the same thing for a milk map as well. Okay, and the same thing if we're talking about the children, the children for, let's say, for Fatima, then all of her children would basically be whether milk children, whether she had them biologically, let's say she didn't nurse her biological children later on, but she had already previously nursed other children. And what about if we're speaking about certain pills like prolactin pills? There are these pills, prolactin pills, that some women may use in order to get their milk production, basically, and then they would use that to, especially for adopted children, sometimes they would use that, and they would use prolactin pills in order to, I guess, get that adopted son to make it, or daughter, making them a mahram by taking prolactin pills, even though she doesn't get children, but she used the prolactin pills in order to get basically the ability to nurse. Differences of opinions between scholars on whether the prolactin pills producing milk, on whether that would take the same ruling as, let's call it, the organic, or at least biologically, I don't know what they call it, okay, getting basically milk flowing as a result of pregnancy and having a baby. So just wanted to note that one. So to stay on the safe side, if you had a sister that was probably getting already let's call it the organic milk, meaning that she is nursing, and you wanted to make that child, that adopted child, as a mahram to you, that would probably be a preferred opinion, but it's a considerable opinion as well. So just wanted to note that one. So when we're speaking about, go ahead, somebody unmuted themselves.
Your medicine. I haven't eaten dinner. Huh? I haven't eaten dinner. What do you mean? I didn't eat dinner. I didn't eat dinner first.
I think that was by mistake. Okay, let's see. I was trying to even understand what was being said and I couldn't. Okay, let's see. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَإِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً قَالُوا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهَا آبَاءَنَا وَاللَّهُ أَمَرَنَا بِهَا قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ. And of course, this was referring to the disbelievers during the pre-prophetic era, during the time of Jahiliyyah, when they used to go around the Kaaba. What they used to do is that they used to give this narrative that the reason why they would go around the Kaaba naked, men and women naked, just imagine. But the women, they wouldn't go fully naked. They would wear a sheet that's open from the sides, but it would be think of it as, maybe I can do that drawing. So this would be basically the woman, and she would have a sheet basically open from the sides, but it would be covering the front, it would be covering the back. Okay, but just imagine that. I mean, and that's their way of basically, that's their way of making that Hajj. Okay. And certainly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had commented on this ritual because they gave the narrative, and they said that the reason why they were doing that is because they had found their ancestors doing that, and because they had committed sin using those garments. So they wanted to be free of any of those effects or influences of the different sins of the different garments of sin. So they would basically go around the Kaaba completely naked. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically called it that when they would do al-fahisha, this isn't talking about zina, but this is actually talking about undressing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling undressing, stripping naked, even if it's for a religious claimed purpose, that was considered fahisha, that was considered as an illicit act. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُلْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَأْمُرُ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ. Say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not order for al-fahsha. So basically, those kind of, shores when you would have people basically in their swimming suits, etc., that's a place of fuhsh. Based on this area, it's a place of fuhsh and tafahush. It's a place of fuhsh to be, even if you're probably wearing your hijab, but everyone else is wearing their swimming suits. Even if you were to wear a burkini, you don't belong in this area where everyone is practicing fahsha. So fahsha is not necessarily exclusive to zina, but it's also including any form of undressing and revealing the awra. Okay, let's see. In regards to the wording, al-fahsha itself, let's look at this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya bani Adam, يا بني آدم لا يفتننكم الشيطان كما أخرج أبويكم من الجنة ينزع عنهما لباسهما ليريهما سوآتهما. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, O children of Adam, let not Satan tempt you as he removed your parents from paradise, stripping them of their clothing to show them their private parts. So what happened? Okay, so Shaitan himself was basically seducing, and in order to seduce them, he basically had seduced them first to basically uncover themselves. In other words, the beginning of any fahsha, any illicit behavior, any immorality within the society is basically telling people and stripping their clothes off as something that is beautiful, as something that is freedom, and giving it just different names. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, Ya bani Adam qad anzalna alaykum libasa yuwari sawatikum warisha wa libasu taqwa dhalika khair. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, O children of Adam, we had revealed garments that would cover your private parts. And he said, وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى, and the dress of taqwa, the dress and the garment of piety and religious integrity is basically best. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us that there's a certain garment, there's a certain appearance that would basically resemble piety, that would resemble religious integrity, that's the best. So in other words, when people would ask you, is it halal to wear this garment? Is it permissible for me to do piercing? Is it permissible for me to dress in this type of clothing? And I would say, I want you to ask yourself, when you would see yourself in the mirror, do you see that this garment is giving you an inspiration of piety, an inspiration of being amongst the believers? Or is it giving you an inspiration that you fit in with a believer and you fit in with a disbeliever? What is it inspiring in? What is it inspiring you into? The whole object of hijab is not only to cover. The whole object of hijab and the main object, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَن يُعْرَفْنَ فَلَا يُؤْذَيْنَ. The main object, ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَن يُعْرَفْنَ, so that you would be recognized as a woman of bashfulness, as a woman of religious integrity, as a woman of piety, and that way they would recognize to keep distance and not trespass their boundaries with you. And that's the same thing, that when you say libasu taqwa, libas is generally clothing, but libas is also the covering. It's also the attire. This attire, is it revealing something that you would feel as this is your identity? What is the identity that you would like others and yourself to see and to recognize about yourself? The identity is supposed to be an identity of taqwa. If this is showing an identity of taqwa, then the object of hijab is going to be kicking in and affecting your spirituality. Okay, hijab is not just for the guys not to see you.
Maybe you could
Hijab is
explain what
also for
taqwa
yourself.
is.
Fair enough. So taqwa basically means that you have strong love for the Lord Almighty, that you fear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not be content if he were to see you in a certain sin or in a certain way. So taqwa is having strong love for the sake of the Lord Almighty, that you fear transgressing his limits, and you fear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might not accept you in the way that you're in. Okay, so taqwa would basically be religious integrity, spiritual integrity. Would be, you would have this inner integrity, inner faith, that on the inside, you would want it to resemble the other piece of what you are. So this integrity is not only on the inside, but it's also the identity that basically is apparent to you and you are proud of it, and is apparent to others for them to identify you through that identity that you are proud to carry. Okay, so let's see. The Prophet ﷺ, basically had said in regards to the limitations of, well, how much can the man uncover and how much can the woman uncover? The Prophet ﷺ, in terms of the man's awra would be basically from the belly button to the knee. But is the knee included? Can it be a little above the knee? Is the knee included or is it not included? That's that differences of opinions between scholars, whether it is included, whether it's not included, and so forth. That's a one area. But in general, the Prophet ﷺ has said, لا تبرز فخذك ولا تنظر إلى فخذ حي أو ميت. Do not expose your thigh and do not look at the thigh of a living or a dead person. The Prophet ﷺ said, غطي فخذك, in another hadith, فإن الفخذ عورة. The Prophet ﷺ said, cover your thigh because the thigh is awra. It's an area that is supposed to be covered. And certainly that's for a man. But what about a woman? For a woman, the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, المرأة عورة, that a woman is supposed to be all awra. What is awra? Awra is basically an area that's supposed to be covered, an area that you would be shy to expose. That's awra. So as the woman, the Prophet ﷺ had basically given the certain descriptions and let's say the certain regulations of what and how and what the garment is supposed to be covering, but didn't necessarily specify a certain fashion. The Prophet ﷺ had said, إذا كان الدرع سابغا يغطي ظهور قدميها. When Salama had asked, can a woman pray in a dir', in a khimar? So what's a dir' and what's a khimar? So basically, a dir' is supposed to be the garment that would cover basically the torso, and the khimar would be what would cover from the top of the head. Okay, so the dir' would be kind of like a abaya, a long garment that would cover from the shoulders downwards. Okay, il-khimar would be the garment that would cover from the head downwards. Okay, so she asked, can a woman just pray in this dir', and which is basically from the shoulder downwards, and the khimar basically from the head downwards? And the Prophet and she said, وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهَا إِزَارٌ, and she's not wearing basically what would cover from the waist down. So she's not wearing trousers, she's not wearing a skirt, but she's wearing a dir'. Okay, she's just wearing a dir', something that would cover from the shoulders down and basically from head down. So she, kind of like a hijab and kind of like a long abaya, but of course that would be, but she's not wearing anything underneath, she's not wearing trousers, she's not wearing a skirt. And the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا كَانَ الدِّرْعُ سَابِغًا, if the dir', which is the shoulder down, that garment from the shoulder down, if it was covering يغطي ظهور قدميها, if it's covering basically ظهور قدميها, if it's covering her feet, if it was long enough to cover her feet, then that would be permissible. If it's long enough to cover her feet, that would be permissible. If not, then that would not be permissible. Okay, well, when we speak about the dir' basically covering the feet, what is ظهور قدميها? How much is ظهر القدم? Are we talking about if we are to have this foot, let me draw a nicer foot. Okay, here we go. If this is a foot, is this ظهر القدم? So is it supposed to be long enough to even cover this ظهر القدم? Is this ظهر? Well, what does ظهر mean? ظهر means back. Is this the back of the foot or is this the back of the foot? Which one is the back of the foot? That's the differences of opinions between scholars. So in other words, is it supposed to be that dirra, is it supposed to be long enough to cover up to here? Or is it supposed to be long enough to cover up to here? Or is it supposed to be long enough to cover up to here? Okay. Can I just wear socks? And that's that differences of opinions between scholars. Do I have to wear socks as a woman while in prayer? In other words, are my feet considered awra or not in prayer? Differences of opinions between scholars. Why would they have differences of opinions between scholars? Because the word ظهر is ambiguous because it means back. Is this the back? Is this the back? Is this the back? What is the back of a foot? Okay. All are valid opinions. Okay. Just wanted you to, just note that. So do I have to wear socks or not? Now you see right in front of you why they had differences of opinions. Okay, let's see. Well, it is very obvious that the Prophet ﷺ had said, لا يقبل الله الصلاة حائض إلا بخمار, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not accept the prayer of a woman that reached the age of puberty / a woman reached the age of menstruation until or unless she would wear al-khimar. So when we speak about al-khimar, here we go. Remember when we said, so we're just talking about a hijab that covers from the head down. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ, here's the other note hadith. Remember when we said when a certain wording in a certain hadith may contain some ambiguity, then we would have to get the other reports, because that's basically to give us the clarity and basically the accurate interpretation before we would jump and basically say that, hey, she could just cover the head, and even if she were to wear shorts, that's okay, and take the note basically that the Prophet ﷺ had said that a woman is supposed to be wearing a khimar, and basically considering that, well, if as long as she's wearing a khimar, that's basically what marks as the that's what marks as the limitation. So what we're saying here is that il-khimar, just the word itself, is not enough, but we would basically have to go to the other reports, just like this report, that it's supposed to be covering all the body. Okay, just to make that one. Let's see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in regards to women, okay, he had said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إلا ما ظهر منها وليضربن بخمرهن على جيوبهن ولا يبدين زينتهن إلا لبعولتهن. I want you to look at this one. This ayah says, and they should not reveal and display their adornments except which is necessarily appears thereof, and to wrap a portion of their head covers over their bosoms, and not display their adornment except to their husbands. I would want to say a couple things here, because many times people would ask me questions. So when you look at وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ, does that mean that they should not show basically the different adornments? Are we talking about an adornment, whether we're speaking about an actual, maybe beautiful thing that was on my abaya? Are we talking about some beautiful thing on the abaya, or are we talking about the abaya itself? Are we talking about things like makeup? Is that the adornment? Or are we talking about things like jewelry? Is that the adornment? Differences of opinions between scholars, because the word zina is actually not identified. So majority of the scholars, they regarded that beautification in general is supposed to be something that a hijabi woman in public, and when I say in public, I don't mean outside, because there was a sister that was asking, so is there a difference between outside going public and between, let's say, staying at home? It's not an issue of going public or, at home. That's not at all the point. The point is, are there mahrams or not mahrams? Okay, that's the whole point. So if we're speaking about non-mahrams present, if they are at your house, well, you should be basically covered as you are in public, to basically appear in a modest way. Okay, so that would be the whole idea. It's not an idea of public and how you would appear, on the street, but we're actually talking about mahram or not mahram. Whether you wanted to iron your clothes, you wanted to, I don't know, wear certain attire that was basically something that you would like to appear in public, well, good for you. That's basically a sunnah to, dress in a way that also is ironed, that looks good, that looks appropriate, that shows a certain, let's say, appreciation of probably what you're capable of affording. Well, that's very nice of you. You could also show that and address it. Certainly, there's nothing wrong with it. But وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ. So now we're talking about a certain limit, that they should not reveal their beautification. So then you would have another opinion considered لَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ, that the context is actually talking about not revealing their beautification, meaning whether it's acquired beautification. That was another interpretation. What do we mean acquired beautification? Acquired beautification meaning you putting on foundation, you putting on mascara, you putting on the jewelry, you putting on beautification. That's one thing. So when you look at إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, that would be this exception. What is إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا? In other words, what she, except we're speaking about that exception, except what she was actually created in. So she is basically beautiful, okay? And she did her job in covering her body. She did her job in putting on the hijab. And is إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا is that exception? Is that referring to, let's call it natural beauty? In other words, her face is beautiful. Mashallah, some women, you could, even if she's wearing hijab, you're like, she is very beautiful. Okay. And other women, let's say their beauty is pretty much on a moderate level, not exceptionally beautiful. So إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. If we're speaking about exceptionally beautiful women, does that mean that, hey, she's got, let's call it organic, and basically she was created beautiful, and therefore she's supposed to be wearing a niqab and covering her face? Or is covering the face basically an extra credit? And how do we understand that piece of it? Okay, now this is differences of opinions. I'm just going to make the story short because I can go on and on with this one. But إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا was one of those quotes that scholars had differences of opinions on whether this would mean that the face can be uncovered as long as she doesn't have maybe foundation, makeup, or any types of beautification on it, jewelry or whatever it is, and therefore إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا, that would be that exception, since she is basically not displaying her beautification, different cosmetics, and etc. And certainly إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا إِلَّا مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا. And certainly, if we're speaking about the different types of adding on to the beautification, then that would not be permissible to reveal and display the different types of beautification. So, وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ. The word daraba actually means to strike, but this isn't talking about anybody, putting on the hijab and basically beating herself with it. Absolutely not. All right. وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُورِهِنَّ. This is talking about that when she's laying her hijab, she's not, some sisters would be putting the hijab on and they're tightening it all the way, kind of like they would have like the Nike sports hijab. It's completely tight on them and it's so tight that it basically makes them, it's so tight that it's basically shaping the neck, shaping the head, shaping the body, etc. That's not what وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ means. وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ basically means that it's loose, okay? Because when you're speaking about darb on something, you're speaking about striking it, you're letting it go, you're not letting that hijab be something that is shaping you. So darb is you're basically putting it on and you're letting it loose on your chest area, you're letting it loose on your body, and it's not shaping the body. So where did we get that? How did you get وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ, that it's basically talking about loose and not shaping the body? We got it from the Prophet ﷺ when, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked, about a certain garment, and he said, if it does not reveal the shape of her bones. Well, this isn't talking about the bone, but this isn't talking about the actual bone, but this is talking about shaping the body. So it should not be shaping the body, and that's why it should be loose on the body and not shaping it. So بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جِيُوبِهِنَّ, that they should be letting al-khimar. Khimar is basically the head covering. Al-khimar is not necessarily the face covering, but it's basically the head covering. عَلَى جِيُوبِهِنَّ. Al-jayb is not the pocket. Al-jayb is basically the opening in the chest area. وَلَا يُبْدِينَ زِينَتَهُنَّ إِلَّا لِبُعُولَتِهِنَّ. They should not display their beautification except to their spouses. And of course, the details go on, and we explained that one. Okay, so in other words, beautification, the way that you would dress in front of your siblings or probably in front of your father is different than the way that you would dress in front of your spouse. Okay, that's a completely different object, a completely different area. So therefore, even if you are in front of your mahrams, even if you don't necessarily want to wear your hijab, and you don't necessarily have to wear your hijab because it's not obligatory. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made an exception. But even if you are in front of your siblings, in front of your father, you want to put on a certain amount of let's just call it modesty. A certain amount of modesty where it's covering basically the body to also bring in honor, to bring in adab, to bring in mannerisms, to bring in certainly, a certain level. And we'll talk about the level. If we're speaking about woman to woman, certainly, scholars had differences of opinions. Are we talking about from the belly button, if we're talking about woman to woman, belly button to the knee, or are we talking about more? Okay. So all scholars would agree that if such a garment is made to enhance a certain behavior or a certain idea or a certain, let's say, garment, certain garments, you ladies understand what I'm talking about, certain garments might be to display or enhance the appearance of certain body parts to show that this person is appearing in a certain way. Well, that would not be fit for a Muslim woman, whether she was dressed like that in front of a Muslim woman or whether that was in front of her mahram men, you know, certain attires is not befit, because that's more in front of your husband, because it's meant to give a certain message. But in front of women, you shouldn't be dressing in that way. You all know what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to use the words. Okay. And same thing if we're speaking about, but there's a difference. Let's say a woman nursing her baby in front of other women. And certainly between dressing in a certain way to enhance a certain, I guess, a certain reveal, a certain, let's say, appearance. Okay, let's just use that word. Then in that situation, it would not be the same. Okay, nursing in front of another woman is completely different. The other thing is that, of course, the thigh is definitely awra and should not be appearing in front of women. So the mini skirts and all of that, that's not appropriate in front of other women, even if they are Muslim women. Okay, just wanted to note that one. And what if this woman was identifying as lesbian? Is it permissible for this woman, for a Muslim woman, to undress in front of her? What I mean undress, I'm meaning that she's not wearing her hijab. Okay, now that's an area of differences of opinions between women, between scholars, not between women, but between scholars. Okay, and I would like to note that Ibn Hazm was one of those scholars that I would like to note, as he lived in a society, Ibn Hazm lived in a society that was rather, I would say, in many ways, having pretty much almost everything. It was a society that was in Al-Andalus, and certainly there was a certain level of ikhtilat, because there were a lot of concubines, and certainly they don't have to wear hijab. The slave women, they don't wear the hijab, okay? They don't have to wear hijab, and they don't wear hijab, and they don't cover up as much as free women, okay? And certainly that was leading to a certain amount and a certain level of fitna within the society. And Ibn Hazm did note that there were some, let's just call it, promiscuous behaviors within that society. And Ibn Hazm was aware of it. And he had said, it's not the exact quote, but his fatwa was, if it's a lesbian woman, that the Muslim woman would treat this lesbian woman as a non-mahram. In other words, cover fully in front of this person that basically has attraction to same sex. In that situation, it would be basically keeping physical distance, including appearance. It must be modest, etc. And certainly Islam was really strict in such types of attractions, and very strict to the point that it considered it as even worse than zina. Okay, worse than zina. Yet it is noteworthy of mention here that they did consider that gayism is actually worse than lesbianism. Worse because of a number of different reasons, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was talking about it. It doesn't mean that it's a minor sin. Both are major sins, but of course, in terms of gayism, that's actually much worse, and certainly that's the action of Qawm Lut. Okay, so when we're speaking about وَإِذَا سَأَلْتُمُوهُنَّ مَتَاعًا فَاسْأَلُوهُنَّ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَابٍ, inshallah, we will be talking about, of course, more in terms of covering the awra and hijab and so forth, inshallah, next week. Right now I have a long drive, 50-minute drive, to basically head to my child's appointment, so I'm gonna need to stop it right here, inshallah, and continue, inshallah, continue the day after tomorrow, I believe. Let's see, so the sister is saying, so if they all live together, Maryam would always have to be covered in front of the sons. And this is regardless of the age of these children. No, it's not regardless of the age. But one, if we're talking about the story of the example that Maryam the daughter of Asiya, and basically the husband coming in with his sons from a previous marriage. So yes, Maryam, once she reaches the age of puberty, and once the boys reach the age of puberty, okay? Once the boys reach the age of puberty, then Maryam certainly cannot be alone with those boys in that household, meaning at least they're both together alone, okay? And plus, she would definitely have to wear the hijab in front of them. So that would be something to be taken in consideration, okay? Certainly. But Asya can uncover in front of those boys from the previous marriage. So right. So you said Maryam and her stepbrothers. So right. So those stepbrothers, basically, okay, they would not be a mahram to Maryam because Maryam comes from a different marriage, and those boys are not related to Maryam. Okay, but if, of course, her mother, that is Asya, were to get more children from this husband, okay, those children would basically be half brothers or half siblings, basically, to Maryam, because they share mother, but not share father. Okay, but Asya's husband, we talked about whether he's a mahram to Maryam or not. Okay, so I hope I answered those questions, inshallah. If there are any fast questions right now, inshallah, I'd be happy to answer them really quick. Okay, well, fair enough. I guess you're wanting me to run to my appointment really fast before it's getting too late. So subhanakallah.